Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us for the webcast covering prescription digital therapeutics, a win-win for employers and employees, sponsored by AIMED Alliance. This webcast has been pre-approved for an HRCI credit. Please be sure to attend the complete webcast in order to receive your credit. You will receive an email from hr.com within 2 business days, which will include the certification credit information. You may also log into your hr.com account and view the credits you have received. If you have questions during the webcast, simply click on the Q&A box in your webinar controls and type them in. And now it is my pleasure to turn it over to our presenters.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us for this important webinar hosted by AIMED Alliance. Today's topic is covering prescription digital therapeutics, a win-win for employers and employees. My name is Kevin Massey, and I'm chair of the board at AIMED Alliance. For those who are unfamiliar with AIMED Alliance, we are a 501c3 not-for-profit health policy organization. Our mission is to protect and enhance the rights of healthcare consumers and providers. AIMED Alliance also supports laws, regulations, policies to help make healthcare safe, accessible, culturally competent, efficient, ethical, and transparent. We recognize the vital role that HR executives in providing comprehensive healthcare coverage for America's workers. AIMED Alliance's goal today in presenting our webinar is to empower participants with knowledge of prescription digital therapeutics. Our speakers will discuss how providing insurance coverage of prescription digital therapeutics is a win-win for both employers and employees. We hope you enjoy our program today. And AIMED Alliance's staff attorney, Ashira Ventris Esquire, will get us started. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Massey. The COVID-19 pandemic has illuminated the growing use of technology in healthcare. And as our speakers will explain today, the broad scope of digital health includes mobile health, health information, wearable devices, telehealth, personalized medicine, and prescription digital therapies. In recent years, the Food and Drug Administration has authorized the marketing of prescription digital therapies, also known as PDTs. PDTs are now available to support the treatment of many conditions, including ADHD, chronic low back pain, substance use disorder, and type 2 diabetes. Last year, recognizing the growth of technology in healthcare, AIMED Alliance launched Action for PDTs, a multidisciplinary collaboration that is working to expand patient access to and insurance coverage of prescription digital therapies. Over the last year, Action for PDTs has developed fact sheets, hosted webinars, submitted comments to federal regulatory boards, and supported federal legislation and engaged in a variety of advocacy efforts to improve patient access to PDTs. Throughout our work, we have also recognized the important role employers play in this discussion, as many people receive their health insurance coverage through their employers. Therefore, today's webinar, we will inform attendees on how PDTs work and are approved by the FDA through randomized clinical trials and are prescribed under clinical supervision, how health technologies can expand access to treatment for employees, how PDTs can improve employee health outcomes and reduce employer costs, and how PDTs can be added to employer formularies. Today's webinar will feature presentations by Mr. Timothy Unks, Dr. Wayne Burton, and Ms. Katie Archer. I would briefly like to introduce our 3 speakers. First, Mr. Unks is an associate professor of pharmacy practice and a clinical pharmacist in the home health setting. He has over a decade of experience in the digital health space, focused on digital therapeutics, remote patient monitoring, medication adherence, and digital biomarkers. Mr. Unks will serve as an advisor and consultant to digital health companies and is a recognized expert with multiple publications and international and national speaking engagements. Mr. Unks will be laying the foundation for today's presentation on PDTs. Following Mr. Unks, Dr. Burton will present on the growing employer trend of covering prescription digital therapies. Dr. Burton is board certified in internal medicine and is a former corporate medical director of both JPMorgan Chase and American Express. Currently, Dr. Burton works as a consultant and as a professor of clinical medicine at Northwestern University's Feinberg School of Medicine. Lastly, Ms. Archer will provide a first-hand perspective on how employers may add PDTs to their employees' health insurance coverage. Ms. Archer is the Director of Health, Welfare, and Benefit Design, Planning and Analysis at the Hartford Financial Services Group. Prior to working at the Hartford, Ms. Archer managed domestic and international benefit and well-being programs at Alexion Pharmaceuticals, International SOS, and Goldman Sachs. Ms. Archer also played an instrumental role in engaging her current employer, the Hartford, to become the first employer to provide coverage of PDTs as a healthcare benefit. On behalf of AIMED Alliance, I would like to thank all speakers for participating in today's webinar and helping advance the conversation around access and coverage to prescription digital therapeutics. And with that, I will turn the presentation over to Mr. Angst.
Thank you for that kind introduction. So really excited to talk today about basically what is digital health and digital therapeutics. So what does this all mean? So let's advance the slides and let's see what we got. So digital therapeutics, I think the big question is, what are they? What do they do? And as we look at that, I think we can, if we look at the next slide, we can see that the emphasis right now is that we live really in a mobile world. I mean, we've seen this in the past 2 years of the ongoing pandemic, how much of a focus has been on transforming how do we engage in society? How do we use new technologies to basically engage? Like, whether it's shopping, whether it's communication, whether it's participating in conferences through this type of medium. I think it's acceptable to say that we are seeing a paradigm shift in terms of just how we as a society function. And with that, as we see in the next slide, that doesn't just mean in terms of just our daily activities about how we go about our lives, but also how does this actually change healthcare itself? But if we look at the next slide, what we'll see is that this isn't necessarily a new idea, like, oh, technology has showed up and suddenly we're going to do things drastically. We've actually gone through different itinerations like this over time. Whether you want to say the rise of the internet back in the 1990s led to what was called the electronic health movement or e-health. And then we had in the early 2000s, especially with the rise of like the smartphone, around the time period, we see this rise for what's called mobile health or m-health, using like early itinerations of apps, or using early devices to track health. And we were like, this is kind of cool, but the technology was still limited at the time. And it's only, I would say, in the past like 5 to 10 years, I would really emphasize 5 years, we've seen that what we now call the digital health movement really come to the forefront, where we have multiple companies and multiple institutions now engaged with this. As we see in the next slide, digital health can be broken into different types of technologies, whether you want to call enterprise system support tools using things like EHRs, whether you want to call like telehealth. This all kind of falls within the digital health umbrella. And really, digital health to me is very much an umbrella terminology with all these different types of technology underneath it. For many of you in the audience, you may actually be using some of this stuff. We look at patient-facing wellness and support programs. That could be things that encourage members to be more active in their life, to help them out with wellness and such, and just their activities. But then it gets a little bit further. And what I mean by further is it moves away from just like something to engage upon as a medium, moving more and more towards actually treating. And this is where we get towards more diagnostic and monitoring and then therapeutic interventions. And that's what really brings us here today, is talking about the fact that can technology actually not only just help monitor, but can actually lead to a treatment, similar to like a medication, similar to some other intervention that could lead to some kind of outcome associated with it. And this is where digital health is now coming forward, is that we see all these different types of technology conglomerating together. And the next slide, we'll see, I mean, going fast, like 80% of people in the United States now access information on the internet for healthcare. That's what they will turn to. They quickly turn to their mobile devices. They want to look up there. They want information. They want it now. Even going further with that, the next slide, we see almost about soon it's going to be about 50% of people are actually using some kind of mobile app device or such to actually engage and track their health. We see this from many different types of devices coming into market, whether it's continuous glucose monitoring, whether it's Bluetooth-enabled blood pressure cuffs, even smartwatches that can tell you if you have atrial fibrillation. But while these technologies are interesting, is what is the application of it? So next slide, what I really would probably do a comparison on is we have been used to this concept of some kind of passive monitoring going on in our lives, but different things we have that we use, whether it's banking. You get an alert saying you charge this much, you get a statement at the end of the month saying how much you spent or what you saved. But your vehicle, if we think about it, you drive around with a vehicle and it tells you, oh, you need oil change, your tire pressure is low, XYZ happens, and you then act on that. So you get these sensors in your vehicle tell you what's going on, and you act on them because you don't want your car not to work. We know that we want to do preventative maintenance. We want to do just-in-time treatments for our vehicle so that it doesn't break apart on us. So how do we actually take that concept of like these different types of data points that we can collect, whether through a device you wear on your wrist that tracks, how much you walk or sleeping, or something maybe a little bit more that you maybe wear on your chest, or maybe just how you engage on an app in your phone, and how do we transfer the patient journey? How do we change this into using these types of data points to actually help us identify our own health. So the next slide, what you'll see is that there's this push then for almost using what's called digital medicine, where we have different types of software and algorithms that are in the background of our life. And what they do is they passively measure us. They say, hey, you're doing a good job. You know, your blood pressure is right at goal, your glucose is right at goal, your A1C, you know, your weight's great, and gives you rewards like, hey, you know, keep up the good work, because we constantly have this data. But when you start seeing something like not quite right, when something is not going in the direction you want, like you're at risk for developing an issue, whether it's maybe musculoskeletal pain or insomnia and such, can we intervene quickly instead of waiting for a person to get in trouble? And by me in trouble, like needing time off, needing to go hospital, needing to go to be, you know, some kind of leave because they had a health condition that they weren't even realizing that was actually becoming problematic. So can we intervene just in time? And I think this is where we're moving from healthcare. This is what we will see the 2020s and 2030s really push, is this concept of how do we use all these different types of digital health tools to help track and intervene for patients as they go about their daily lives. So next slide. And I think this is where we're seeing this kind of push for virtual care engagement, which is utilization of apps, different technology to engage people in their health and reward them for doing a good job, even if it's passively, or intervening when something just goes wrong. Like you could have come into a house, maybe start coughing, and you could have a device that's in the house and says, hey, based on the sound of your cough, you may have COVID or flu or something going on. And would you like to set up a telehealth visit now? Would you like a test to deliver to your house? And this leads, because this is very empowered by telehealth management. And we're going to hear about more telehealth later on with the next speaker, but this type of uptake for this type of work and this technology has shown that there is premise and that there's a situation is building that we can use different types of technology to fit into this kind of care paradigm. The question though ultimately is, you know, what is capable? What should be covered? What kind of technology do you want to use? So let's go to the next slide. And I think that's where we move from just digital health, this concept like, you know, telehealth devices and such, more towards digital therapeutics. And we start getting into what we would say is like the hard sciences, where we actually not just talk about a device that says it can help you out with your sleep, but actually a device or some kind of application that can help you out with insomnia. So the next slide we'll see is that the three terminologies kind of covered is like digital health, which is the overall umbrella, then digital medicine, which is a lot of these diagnostic stuff, and digital therapeutics, which is very much treatment. So when you think about digital therapeutics, the big thing you want to think about with them is that it's some kind of evidence-based software that works to basically prevent, manage, or treat a medical disorder or disease. Next slide. This can range from different things. You could have something that could help with like a low acuity problem. And by low acuity, we mean something that's not immediately going to cause a high risk of harm for a patient. It could be, you know, health and wellness, obesity, stuff like that, versus like, let's suppose someone does have diabetes, you're trying to treat that, or suppose they have depression, you're trying to help actually manage that condition. As we see, and what the FDA has kind of looked at, and as they've been clearing this stuff, is they're looking and saying, are you working with a condition that is high risk or that needs a lot of touch points? For a lot of this, it has led to the concept of, you know, what risk does these treatments want to assume and take on? What is a benefit for a patient at the end of the day? So you see different clinical endpoints for a lot of these different apps or a lot of these digital therapies put out there. They'll say, well, we can improve a function or we can treat it. And that does actually kind of guide in terms of what they're going to do at the end of the day. So next slide. Some of these digital therapeutics, they could come alone. It could just be an app on a smartphone or a tablet. Some of them actually team up with hardware. They may be something that you wear or it's with a wearable device. For instance, we have some out there meant for migraines, which is you actually wear like a patch on the arm. It sends like a electrical stimulation up to the brain to treat migraines without using a medication. So it's a digital therapeutic software that's working with a piece of hardware, in this case, the thing that provides the stimulation. Or you can have digital therapies with a drug. There's actually medications now coming to market that you can actually track how it's being used or actually recommend different dosing. We've seen that with, for instance, with diabetes, where people that have diabetes and using insulin, for instance, with a digital therapeutic will actually tell them what amount of insulin to actually inject. So instead of someone calling them and telling them what to do, now they're actually just getting feedback through the device in the app. Next slide. I think where what we really want to focus on for today, though, is this concept between digital therapeutics and prescription digital therapeutics. So digital therapy is often shortened as DTX, while prescription digital therapeutics are called PDTs. The big exception with PDTs is that these are definitely prescribed software. So while there are many digital therapeutics on the current market that are available for consumers, not all of them necessarily require a prescription. However, as I mentioned, depending on how severe of a condition you may be taking on, what is the ownership of that data, who is actually overseeing that level of care, this is where it gets similar to a medication where you want a prescriber. Well, it could be anywhere from a physician, NP, PA, et cetera, that may actually prescribe a digital therapeutic. And this is where we then shorten down to a PDT, or prescription digital therapeutic. So this is gonna be the focus, these PDTs, which is right now, I would say is like the penultimate type of digital therapies in the market. They've gone probably through the most strenuous clinical studies and associated outcomes, that enough that they are justified by the FDA to at least treat and manage a condition. Next slide. In terms of what we're looking at, in terms of what they're covering, the landscape is actually pretty broad right now. What we are seeing is that there's a focus a lot on chronic disease management. This could be anything from cardiometabolic syndromes such as hypertension, obesity, diabetes, or prediabetes, trying to reduce that risk. Along with that, then, we are also seeing mental health and addiction medicine have a huge uptake. And we've seen a lot of this for like depression, anxiety, insomnia, substance use disorder. Much of this is also a focus. And then we also have other people looking at different types of technology within oncology support, neurology. We're also seeing musculoskeletal conditions also come into play. Also emerging areas such as in women's health with helping out with bladder support. And you look at this and you're like, how does this technology all do these types of things? They range from providing almost levels of education for the patient on the go. They range from cognitive behavioral therapy. Their mechanism of action, how they work, almost to me what ends up happening is they mimic what is being done traditionally in care. But if we look back, of course, at like the pandemic, if you need to schedule a visit to go see someone in person to provide therapy, there's a time amount that goes into it. You have certain hours that you can go talk to someone. You are then responsible on your own to carry out whatever you need for yourself. And the question then ultimately becomes, is this process all that good? And what's available? That, if you're in a region that there's not a lot of therapists available and time to see a therapist is 6 months out, what are you gonna do for the remaining 6 months? Is your provider just gonna say, well, let's just use medications because at least we have a solution there, or can we do something else where you have to wait for this amount of time? And I think this is where we look at the whole benefit of digital therapies. It's meeting people or users where they're at. It's to help scale up the accessibility of these types of technologies and interventions that mimic traditional therapy, but because of constraints, whether around logisticals, in terms of travel, or just scheduling, it may be non-feasible for certain employees at the end of the day to actually engage in this stuff. I mean, evidence supports like cognitive behavioral therapy works very well, but how easy is it to get that traditional support? How easy is it to get that traditional treatment? I think that's what comes to the question. And if these devices serve as a means to delivering that, then there's benefit. Not necessarily saying one's superior or inferior to the other, but what it comes down to how the FDA is kind of looked at is like, these are delivering very similar interventions. The intervention though, versus being in person versus through a device or an app, is the different medium, as long as they lead to the same outcome as what we desire, whether it's a improvement on depression, lowering issues with substance use, helping you sleep. Those are types of things that they're looking for in terms of outcome. So very high amount of different therapeutic areas that we're seeing. So next slide, to emphasize, what we'll probably see is chronic disease management will be a big one to focus on. The other one's going to definitely be mental health and substance use disorder. I would say mental health post-pandemic is likely to be something that's going to be more rampant than we saw in the past. And that from that, we're going to see a big push for people desiring either to work with a therapist or such. And then ultimately the psych field will see that there's a high amount of demand, but a low amount of supply in terms of providers that are able to actually engage in these services. And this is stuff that we're really trying to figure out right now clinically. And even me personally dealing with my own patients, this is stuff that we're seeing now. The other one is like musculoskeletal conditions, people getting hurt on the job or trying to prevent that, trying to get them to actually see like a physical therapist in person, or can we do it at home? It's those types of things we're trying to say, like, what can we actually not necessarily replace, but help offer new solutions or tools for our employees and our members that didn't have options to in the past. So I'll go through a few cases just to give an example of what this looks like. So next slide. let's talk about lower back pain. Like if you think about like standard issue, like, if I injure my back, or if I have lower back pain problems, I'm gonna make an appointment with my PCP or something. I'm gonna see them. If they think it's really bad, they may refer me to a specialist or refer me to go see a physical therapist, and I have to schedule with some physical therapy. I have to bill it, make sure they cover it. Then I'm gonna go to the physical therapist to have this visit done. So am I going to call out for that day? Am I going to, when does that work within my schedule? Like, how do I, figure out when I can do that? And then I have to do those visits. And I'm also going to have to do my home physical therapy. I may go back to my own therapist and tell them, this is what I've been doing. And they say, well, you haven't been doing it right, and have to keep going through the whole process. And then, follow through PCP if you're having improvement or not. It can be a very much like hurry up and go. But the main focus is it's on the patient at the end of the day to really drive this ship. If they have issues, they may not be adherent to therapy, they may not have anyone reminding them to do it. They're responsible for scheduling and making all these appointments. It can be a lot going on, especially if they're having a lot of that pain, right? But what if you had a digital therapeutic or prescription digital therapeutic that you make that appointment, you see a PCP or specialist, and they say, hey, we had this digital therapeutic or PDT that you can use at home. And so you go home, set up your smartphone, it watches you, it tells you what movements to do, helps you track it, and you can report through that app, I'm having improvement or I'm not having improvement. And it can escalate what therapy to do. And the PCP can remotely monitor. It might say, hey, this therapy is working or this therapy is not working. Instead of waiting for the patient to come back and tell me, I can actually remotely monitor, get feedback. And that therapy, the patient can do it anytime. They can do it in the evening after work. They can do it in the weekend. And it will remind them to do that. And if they're not doing it, then the PCPs also know they're not following through. So this is like the change in the paradigm. This is a change of how we can provide care. So next slide, another one we could look at is, let's say, like mental health. This would cover everything from anxiety, sleep problems, depression, and such. And it's the same, very similar model. You maybe go see someone, they ask questions, your PCP is saying, it looks like you may be having insomnia or depression. They may try treating themselves, or they may refer you for therapy. And then you have to schedule what therapist is within your coverage, making appointments for that therapy, following through with it, and then following up with your PCP, telling you whether or not approved or not, and whether you need to escalate. Again, it's very similar to other therapy we've been talking about so far. What if you could take and use a PDT instead? You go see PCP and they say, you know what, why don't you try this actually instead? Maybe we'll do this before we try medications. Maybe you're having trouble with sleep, so this thing will help you with sleep hygiene, so it can help you have more different approach in terms of how to manage your sleep. And if that doesn't work, maybe we can try medication. But at least, we had this kind of thing that we can fall back on and try this first. And logistically, again, it benefits the patient in terms of trying these things, monitoring how they're doing it, and giving feedback. Okay, the next one we'll look at last is family care. This one, this is something I see a lot too, is that it's not just your own health. It could be also, your loved ones you have to take care of. It could be a parent, also could be a child. Child has an issue going on, maybe it's like something related to behavior. Again, we're seeing the increase of that after the pandemic. So you make a schedule to see your pediatrician, they refer you for therapy, you got scheduled therapist visits. Now it's not only for your time, but also for your child time, taking them out, and then taking them out daycare for the day. Then you have to take them home, you're watch them all day because you're not going to go drop them off or what. Then follow with the pediatrician, see if that works. So you have to have another referral and such. Again, a lot on that patient to then drive it. A lot for them, the added burden of having to then navigate for a child. Versus, again, if they have a digital therapeutic or PDT that's available for the child to use, instead of meeting them on their own time, would that help? Would that help reduce visits that have to be done in person? Can a lot of it be done remote, for instance, and could be monitored better? This, I hope you can see, like, this is a general theme, is like, again, like the whole value of digital health is meeting people where they're at within their daily lives, accepting the fact that logistically there is some issues around traditional care. And from the pandemic and from what's been going on for the past 2 years, we've learned that we can use different types of technology. Post-pandemic and in the 2020s and 2030s, trying to adapt is how can we escalate or use these types of devices and apps out there, especially as we see the FDA giving clearance and say they do work and they're beneficial. Where do we slide them in? Where can we use them? What is the best things to use overall? And I think these are questions we're gonna have to ask, because as we see in the last slide, there's a lot of companies out there. There's a lot of different technologies that are coming to market. This is a very hot topic area, and I think it's very exciting. The trouble is going to be, what should we work with and what should we cover? So with that, looking forward to turning to the next speaker who will go more in detail. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Unk. That's a really helpful presentation, kind of just helping us understand the landscape that we're in right now. And next, I would like to turn it over to Dr. Burton.
Thanks very much, Ashera, and it's a great honor to be here and part of this panel. And Mr. Hanks has done a magnificent job of defining the landscape of digital medicine and digital therapies. I'm going to start out with two questions, poll questions for the group. And Mackenzie, could you pull up the first poll question, please? So the first question is for the audience is, how would you rate your knowledge of PDAs prior to the webinar today and prior to the presentation that Tim just made? If you could answer this, we'll give you about 10 seconds to answer it. The responses are exceptionally knowledgeable, very knowledgeable, knowledgeable, somewhat knowledgeable, and not knowledgeable. So if you respond, and 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Could you pull up the responses, please, Mackenzie? So you can see that 50% of you are not knowledgeable prior to this. 42% were somewhat knowledgeable, but very few were knowledgeable about PDAs. And that's really, quite honestly, what we expect. This is a new field, as Tim was mentioning. So I have a second question for you. Again, answer it from the standpoint of prior to the presentation that you just heard. The second question is, does your organization currently cover or plan to cover PDAs, FDA authorized PDAs? The answers are yes, no, possibly, or uncertain. You have 10 seconds to answer. 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 2, 1. Mackenzie, would you pull up the responses to this, please? So we found that 8% plan to or currently are offering PDAs. Thanks very much. So we'll go to the first slide. And my presentation today will be from the employer standpoint. The pandemic, as we know, has highlighted the underinvestment in digital health throughout the country, not only from the provider side, but also from the employer side. In addition, the US is in the midst of decades-long behavioral health care crisis that has been exacerbated, as we know, by the pandemic. The number of Americans reporting symptoms of anxiety or depression has grown from 1 in 10 in 2019 to 4 in 10 in 2021. Deaths due to drug overdoses and alcohol overdose have soared during the pandemic. As we transition to the post-pandemic period, we hope that we're entering that now, as you know, we're seeing a new era for the workforce and the workplace. And this new era includes remote working, the Great Resignation, demand for flexible work environments, need for caregiving support, mental health, addressing diversity, equity, and inclusion, just to name a few. As a result, there are at least 3 key healthcare themes in the reimagination of healthcare benefits now and into the foreseeable future. 1, location and convenience of healthcare matters most to the majority of employees and their families, as Tim has pointed out. Telehealth or virtual care is here to stay. Virtual visits peaked at over 50% in the second quarter of 2020, and since then have stabilized around 11%. As you know, this compares to probably less than 1% pre-pandemic visits. And finally, the importance of quality of care. Next slide, we see that in 2020, more than 1 in 5 employees reported using virtual healthcare in the past 4 weeks, in the past month. This was the National Household Pulse Survey. The pandemic has accelerated healthcare's providers' movement into the digital experience so that they can maintain a relationship with their patients. Providers are now fine-tuning their digital front door, including the use of mobile apps that connect patients and providers. Both patients and clinicians expect useful digital tools as part of their healthcare journey, as well as increasing the capacity and building stronger, more continuous relationships with patients. In the next slide, we see again the results from the National Health Interview Survey in 2020. And this shows that healthcare providers and patients are using telehealth and telemedicine. You can see that prior to the pandemic, relatively few patients in these different groups, age, ethnicity, race, and sex, had access to a healthcare provider that used digital health, mainly telemedicine. By mid-pandemic in 2020, it almost tripled. But more importantly, in the third column, patients are using telehealth, and we're using telehealth and telemedicine for their appointments and conversations and visits with their healthcare providers. Most importantly, older patients utilize telemedicine to a greater extent than younger adults. Regardless of race or ethnicity, telemedicine was used, and women tended to use telemedicine to a greater extent than men. About half of people with anxiety or depression actually used virtual healthcare during the pandemic. In the next slide, I'll share with you a survey of 180 payers or employers who were surveyed about their familiarity with PDTs, prescription FDA-approved PDTs for the most part. And similar to the results of the survey of this group, less than a quarter of the respondents were familiar with PDTs. And in my own experience, even employers who believe they have some familiarity with PDTs are really interested, and they find out that they don't know as much as they thought they did about PDTs and what they can offer to their employees. Actually, these results should not be surprising, given that the field of PDTs is so relatively new. And as you see that right now, there are currently less than 10 FDA authorized PDTs, although as Tim mentioned, there are many others in the pipeline. The next slide shows that the majority of authorized PDTs are available to treat behavioral health conditions such as substance use, opioid use, PTSD, chronic insomnia, but they're certainly useful, as you know, for a number of other conditions too. They have emerged as a potentially valuable way to support mental and physical well-being, where traditional healthcare has often presented the kind of challenges you see in this slide. PDTs can connect patients for remote treatment to their healthcare provider. They certainly can address the shortage of healthcare professionals, especially those that are appropriately trained in behavioral health techniques such as CBT. And they also meet patients where, how, and when they want treatment. The next slide shows, again, information from 40 employers and payers who were familiar with PDTs, and they were asked to identify the most important points for coverage, why they decided to cover PDTs. You can see that the most common reasons were: one, they wanted to make sure that the PDT was FDA authorized. They wanted to know that there was published evidence of the effectiveness of the PDT. They hoped that there'd be at least some cost offset of treatment, or at least not adding cost to the system. And finally, they were interested in including, they wanted to know that the PDTs were involved or part of recognized treatment guidelines by national or regional or local organizations. And you can see there's some other reasons too that they were important to them to provide coverage. Next slide. Now, the most important PDT factors for coverage decisions are listed here, and those include evidence of clinical effectiveness. No surprise, we want to make sure that the PDT is effective in treating the condition. We want to make sure that the PDT is safe and patient safety is foremost. They want to require that the PDT is prescribed by a healthcare provider. In other words, they didn't want to cover PDTs that were patient self-prescribed, basically apps. And then finally, make sure that the PDT had demonstrated quality and outcomes. Next slide, please. Now, these employers and payers also identified several medical conditions that had unmet needs for treatment. And no surprise, for the most part, the most common ones were behavioral health conditions where we know that there's a lack of providers in the United States. So the most common gap areas were substance use disorders, opioid use disorders, generalized anxiety disorders, alcohol use disorders, and PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorders. And these were the most common conditions identified by this group. And you can see there are a number of other conditions certainly were identified too that are common: pain, diabetes, insomnia, and so forth on this survey from 2021. Of note is that many of these conditions can benefit from cognitive behavioral therapy, so-called CBT, which is part of many of the PDTs, and an area where we know that there's a lack of trained behavioral health providers in the United States that can actually deliver CBT, especially some of the specialized areas of CBT. Next slide. Now, we might all agree that the framework for determining value of PDTs is rapidly evolving because they are so new, especially in this diverse area of digital therapies. The Institute of Health Improvement, IHI, proposed one of many frameworks for selecting digital health technology. And here's the goals. 1, improve the patient experience. 2, improve population health. And 3, reduce the per capita cost of healthcare. We know that we'd like to bend that healthcare trend. We need to bend the healthcare cost trend. Now, I've listed here 5 value drivers for your consideration when you select PDTs. 1, the ability to increase patient access and the experience in their treatment. 2, total healthcare costs, direct and also indirect costs being absenteeism, disability, and presenteeism, productivity. Improving clinical outcomes, avoiding unnecessary healthcare expenditures, and then there certainly can be societal benefits to bridging a number of the gaps that we know exist in healthcare today. Next slide. So in summary, employers and payers are beginning to recognize the value of PDTs, and they're beginning to cover PDTs because PDTs can fill an important gap in healthcare delivery and treatment as we transition from what I call bricks and mortar to clicks and mortar. Patients who have access to healthcare not only by going into a healthcare provider's office, but also combination of using digital therapies and also seeing providers in their office. Here are some reasons. Certainly with PDTs, you have 24/7 access. They can be more cost effective than other treatments. Clinicians and patients reported outcomes are available. And then you can see some of the other reasons that we've talked about and that Tim has talked about too. So providing employees and their families with the right healthcare at the right time where the patient and their families would prefer to receive care should be the goal of current and future healthcare plan design. And that's why employers are starting to embrace the area of PDTs and how they can enhance the treatment that their patients, that their employees and families are receiving. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Burton. I think that presentation is really helpful in helping the audience understand really how employers more broadly are learning about PDTs and making the decision to provide coverage for PDTs because of the benefits it provides to their employees. And I think that fits really nicely with who we're going to hear from next is Ms. Katie Archer.
Thanks, Ashira. Next slide, please. So just a little bit about the Hartford. My role at the Hartford is to manage the health plan that we offer to our employees and dependents. And a lot of you may be familiar with us because we offer property and casualty insurance to both individuals as well as corporations such as yourself. We offer workers' comp and disability insurance as well as some other products. Our health plan covers about 35,000 total members. And one of the things that makes me proud to work at the Hartford is that we have a stigma-free program that is led by our chairman and CEO. For the past few years, he has been advocating in the community and with other employers as to what we can do as employers or organizations to help prevent the opioid or reverse the opioid epidemic, primarily by removing stigma. When it comes to SUD and even more broadly, other mental health and behavioral health topics. A lot of the reason that we are the first employer to cover prescription digital therapeutics is because we have put a lot of energy into finding ways to help folks with behavioral health needs, such as opioid use disorder. Next slide, please. So the Hartford started looking into PDs before the pandemic, but as with many other conversations that we've had over the last 2 years, a lot of things have been elevated because of the pandemic. And on this page, there's just a couple quotes from some notable organizations that really started talking about PDTs during the beginning of COVID. The FDA had already authorized at least one PDT, but offered this temporary authorization, seeing the value of digital health during the pandemic. Other organizations such as the Kennedy Forum and Shatterproof have also been trying to raise awareness about the value of PDTs. Next slide, please. So what was the Hartford's journey to cover prescription digital therapeutics? I'll mention that we have focused on some of the first available, which were to support substance use disorder and opioid use disorder. And the PBMs just 2 years ago weren't covering these. Their pharmaceutical and therapeutics or P&T committees really don't even still in many cases have a way to evaluate this new form of treatment. The experts on those panels may not have the appropriate resources to truly vet them. And so it has, as with a lot of novel forms of treatment, it is taking longer than many of us would like for coverage to become more mainstream. So because of that, we needed to do some digging on our own. We were able to leverage some internal experts within the Hartford, some of our medical directors, our nurses, but we also were able to line up some of our external partners to get their feedback. We leveraged Shatterproof, our PBM's chief pharmacy officer, one of our partners, Consumer Medical, as well as the Health Transformation Alliance, experts from those organizations to vet this new form of treatment as well. It wasn't just a clinical perspective that we wanted to look at, though. We also spent some time looking at the digital capabilities of PDTs to make sure that they were user-friendly, as an example, intuitive, things like that. And the overall feedback was that all of our subject matter experts kind of gave the green light that this was certainly worth exploring, that there was value in PDT as a form of treatment, that it resulted in improved outcomes. You can see some of the quotes and kind of commentaries on the right as well. One thing I do want to point out is, there was this concept of this is not a silver bullet, especially when you're looking at some complex diagnoses such as SUD. It may not work for everyone. The various forms of treatment available today don't work for everyone, but this is another means of providing support when people need it most, which may not be during their physician's working hours. Next slide, please. So our business case really aligns with the title of today's session. If I were more succinct, I'd say it's a win-win, which is the title. But what we said is this is a low-cost form of treatment that we can offer our health plan members. There's really no downside that we could identify. Unlike traditional medications, we don't have to worry about side effects. It's relatively low cost. And it also provided an opportunity for the Hartford to be a leading voice in a new form of treatment. Remember I mentioned at the beginning that we've really put a lot of energy and focus on helping to remove stigma within behavioral health needs. And this is one item where we could be an example for hopefully others to sort of learn from. Next slide, please. So what I just talked about was the fun part of the journey. We got to meet with subject matter experts. We got to test the product out. But there's also those operational kind of considerations as well. And one of the questions that came up early on is, can our PBM even administer this? And the answer was easier than expected, as the slide says. All that it took was us updating our formulary to cover PDTs and providing that product identifier number so that the claims could be processed. We also spent some time training our call center and other well-being and benefit partners that may be engaging with individuals that would be eligible for the products. Next slide, please. And with that, I'll turn it back over to Ashira and team.
Great, thank you so much. So now we're going to move on to our Q&A portion of the webinar. So I'm just going to stop my screen share and the presenters can turn back on their cameras. So the first question we have is for Mr. Unks. So you've been involved in the digital health space for nearly a decade. How have you seen it evolve, and why is providing coverage for PDTs kind of the next logical step?
One of the things I started when I got into digital health and even mHealth early on was evaluating mobile apps. And I probably have looked at 4,000 apps in my work, and it's exhausting. There are over 300,000 health-related apps now available on the iOS Google Play Store. It is completely unfeasible for anyone to actually go through and try to say what is a good or bad app at these days. Ultimately, I think there was an evolution that had to occur where we got to the point where we actually had to expect companies to take whatever they make, show clinical evidence actually works, that we need a regulatory body come in and actually say there's an approval process within this, so that we could get to the next step where we have providers actually wanting to prescribe and utilize this stuff. And that's taken a decade. I mean, that's the reality of the situation, is that's what we're facing. I think there will be new steps. I think we'll see other organizations do this. We've seen this in Europe with DIGA, in Germany with Digital Therapeutics. We've seen it with an NHS. I think this is how this stuff was going to evolve, because otherwise it's just going to be an unregulated process that we kind of look at like old medications pre-FDA with like snake oil. Like, how do we know something is actually going to lead to a clinical outcome? So that's my current stance when I look at this market.
Great, thank you so much. Our next question is for Dr. Burton. So from your experience as a medical director at large companies, how would you explain the value of covering new innovative therapies like PDTs?
Well, it's really important. And I think right now, part of it has to do with behavioral health therapy. And as a medical director and benefits reported to me several times over the years, behavioral health was one of the problem areas. because the network of providers, there's a lack of providers. Those providers that are so-called in-network, many of them, yeah, they may be in-network, but their practice is closed to new patients. And so there's a long lead time to get into their practices. Some of these patients can be on disability and so forth. So the outcomes and the access is a problem. This is where PDTs, I think, fill an important need now. And we've seen that, as I mentioned. So as a medical director, we embrace this, we embrace technology, and companies like innovation, as Katie mentioned at Hartford. And here's an example of innovation that can really benefit employees and their families.
Great, thank you. I just wanted to remind members of the audience too, they can ask questions in the Q&A or in the chat as well. And I think Dr. Burton, kind of your explanation of this access issue that we see with behavioral health really flows nicely into the next question for Ms. Archer. How do you help raise awareness about PDTs to your employees so they know to ask their healthcare professionals about these options?
It's a very good question. And the PDTs that we cover are for diagnoses that are quite complex. And we actually don't have a high volume of patients in them. Think OUD and SUD. So our challenge is, I think many of the HR professionals on the phone can understand, is we only have so many opportunities to communicate with our employees. So how do we weave this message in when we know it's only helping a very important but small sliver of our population? So the answer is, number one, we get it in whenever we can. Whenever we talk about sort of mental health and behavioral health, as appropriate, we try to have this in as a "did you also know" type of feature. During things like Take Back Your Drug Day, when we're offering drug disposal bags and sort of trying to talk about prevention, we promote it there. But I would say what's been more impactful is we've also looked at things without a ton of success, like having the health plan reach out to the providers treating our members. But that's a very cumbersome process. And by the time we get the claims that they're being treated, the treatment has ended, that's been challenging. So what we found to be most effective is to take a step back and to focus on forums like this. We've decided what we need to do is help make PDTs be more mainstream, be covered en masse. At that point, right now we're sort of a needle in a haystack. Once providers know about this, know that this is covered, we expect to see a big sort of boom in sort of prescriptions. So that's really where we focused our time.
Great. And then the next question, which I think is very in line with kind of this role of educating employees and providers about the availability of PDTs, is for Mr. Ungst. How do you educate on kind of the difference between the digital health apps that you talked about in my app store that I can find and PDTs? How do you kind of put that in layman's terms for people?
That, I think, comes down to evidence of support. Like if we look at this, for example, like if you have a wellness product, you can slide under FDA. Like there's a focus on wellness that the FDA doesn't have to look at, quite honestly. I can make an app and say, this will help you with your sleep. This will help you with anxiety. I'm not saying it's going to help you if you have clinically diagnosed anxiety or if you have clinically diagnosed insomnia. And that's why we've seen a large focus on apps that are on the market that kind of just are there. They purport to help out with some kind of associated with health outcomes, but they're not necessarily meant to like manage, diagnose, or treat. And that's because the FDA won't look at them. That's because of certain regulations are put there. The minute you make something that says, I'm going to do X, Y, Z and treat something, I'm going to treat your substance use disorder, I'm going to treat your depression, that triggers something. The FDA wants you to show me that you're actually going to accomplish this, because otherwise you're making a fallacious claim and we can't trust this. Again, back to this whole snake oil analogy. So for me, the biggest differentiation for a lot of PDTs is that clinical evidence. We accept the fact that we have, like, I'm gonna make an analogy for pharmacy. We have like vitamins out there, but then we also have prescription medications. And one has undergone significant amount of clinical trials to actually justify its use and to be prescribed and to be covered by payers. So ultimately it's the evidence, I would say. that really differentiates a lot of the PDTs currently on the market and their separation from other general health and wellness products available.
Mhm. Great, thank you so much. And I see we have a question in the chat as well for Ms. Archer. It says, is this technology being used at the Hartford in the disability rehabilitation area?
You know, I'm thinking that that's related to workers' comp perhaps and disability, sort of our business side. It is not being used there. I think, you know, my role is to support our own employees, but I would secretly encourage you to ask about it. I certainly, you know, speak with colleagues on that side of the business, and they're aware of it through sort of our partnership. So any help people can provide to raise awareness is awesome.
Definitely. And I see we have one more question for Dr. Burton. So again, from your experience in kind of leadership in these companies, can you explain some of the benefits of being a leader and choosing to cover innovative treatments like PDTs?
Yeah, so I always believed in being like Katie at Hartford, being out front on these things where there's evidence. And clearly there's good evidence on this to fill a gap and not a lot of cost. And so when we looked for products and services to cover, we wanted to, of course, we want to make sure, one, is there a need? And clearly there's a need now for something better in terms of treatment. Two, we would look at cost. And then third, we'll look at outcomes. And PDTs provide outcomes, especially in the area of behavioral health, where I think any employer knows there's not a lot of objective outcomes from patient treatment. And so these outcomes on PDTs are available not only to the patient, but to the provider and ultimately to the payers too. So I think that's an important question, and that's certainly been my experience.
Great, thank you so much. And without seeing any other questions in the chat, I want to take the time to thank all our presenters today for your really educational presentations. I hope it was beneficial to the audience. And this recording will be on the hr.com website. So thank you all so much for your time today. And we appreciate your input and feedback.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you.
Okay, so this concludes our webcast for today. I'd like to thank our presenters as well as all of you for joining us. If you joined late and would like to view this webcast again, the recording and slides will be available on hr.com in our archived webcasts. Your HRCI credit will show up in your hr.com account within 2 business days, and we will also send out an email with the credit information. Please take a few moments to fill out the post-webcast survey that will open up on your screen. Your feedback is very important to us. Thank you all. Enjoy the rest of your day.